My name is Daniel Cohen, and on October 14th, 2017, my life changed forever. I was a devoted rabbi, deeply committed to my faith, my congregation, and the teachings of the Torah. For years, I believed I understood God's will completely, guiding others in the traditions passed down for generations. Christianity was something I respected, but never considered for myself. Jesus, to me, was just a historical figure, important to others, but not the Messiah we had been waiting for. But what I experienced that day shattered everything I thought I knew. It started on a Friday afternoon as I prepared for Shabbat, going over my notes for the evening service. I had done this routine countless times before, but this time, something felt off. A sharp tightness gripped my chest, creeping into my arms, making it harder to breathe. At first, I thought it was stress. I had been working non-stop, after all, but then the pain became unbearable. My wife, Leah, noticed my discomfort and rushed to my side, her voice filled with panic. The last thing I remember was her calling for an ambulance before everything faded away. The next moment, I was no longer in my body. I found myself floating above the scene, watching as the paramedics worked frantically to revive me. I saw my own lifeless form lying on the stretcher, my skin pale, my chest rising only when they forced air into my lungs. But what shook me the most was Leah, standing outside the ambulance, hands pressed together, whispering prayers through her tears. I wanted to reach out to her, to tell her I was still here, but I couldn't. And then, just beyond the ambulance, I saw it. A brilliant light, warm and alive, unlike anything I had ever known. It called to me, drawing me in, and though I resisted at first, I couldn't stop myself from moving toward it. As I moved closer to the light, I felt something I had never experienced before. An overwhelming sense of peace, like every burden I had ever carried was being lifted. It wasn't just a glow or a feeling, it was alive. The warmth surrounded me, filling every part of my being with a love so deep that I couldn't comprehend it. Then, within the light, a figure appeared. At first, it was indistinct, but as I focused, I saw him clearly. His presence was undeniable, majestic, yet so personal, so familiar. And then I looked into his eyes. In that instant, I knew who he was. It was Jesus. Panic surged through me. How could this be? How could the man I had spent my life dismissing now stand before me, more real than anything I had ever known? My mind raced for explanations, trying to deny what my soul already understood. But before I could say a word, he spoke. His voice was calm, steady, filled with both kindness and authority. "Daniel," he said, calling me by name, "you have sought the truth your entire life. But now, it is time to see the fullness of God's plan." His words carried a weight that shook me to my core. I had dedicated my life to studying the Torah, to following the commandments, to guiding others in faith. And yet, in this moment, I felt like a child seeing for the first time. Then, before I could process what was happening, something incredible occurred. The light around us shifted, and suddenly, I was no longer standing in that radiant glow. Instead, I was witnessing visions, scenes from the Torah, moments I had studied, preached, and lived by. But this time, they were different. They weren't just stories or teachings. They were alive, unfolding before me with a depth I had never understood. I saw Abraham on Mount Moriah, his hands trembling as he raised the knife over Isaac. But then, the scene changed. I saw another sacrifice. A man, carrying a cross, his body broken, his face filled with both sorrow and love. It was Jesus. The connection hit me like a thunderbolt. What I had always known as a test of Abraham's faith was actually pointing to something far greater, the sacrifice that had already been made for all of us. As I moved toward the light, I felt something I had never experienced before. A peace so deep, so overwhelming, that it silenced every fear, every doubt I had ever carried. The light wasn't just brightness. It was alive, surrounding me like a warm embrace. I wasn't afraid, but I was confused. This wasn't what I had been taught about death. I had always believed that when my time came, I would be met with judgment, with the weight of my deeds measured against the law. But instead, I felt a presence, powerful, yet gentle. And then, from within the light, a figure emerged. At first, I couldn't see his face clearly, but as he stepped closer, I knew. My entire being recognized him before my mind even processed it. It was Jesus. My heart pounded, not out of fear, but because I knew this shouldn't be possible. I had spent my entire life teaching that Jesus was not the Messiah. I had dismissed his name, his followers, his teachings. And yet, here he was, standing before me, radiating a love so overwhelming that it brought me to my knees. I wanted to look away, to deny what I was seeing, but I couldn't. He wasn't just real. He was the very truth I had been searching for my whole life. "Daniel," he said, his voice steady, filled with both kindness and authority. "You have been faithful, but you have not yet seen the fullness of God's plan." His words pierced through me like a sword, cutting past everything I had built my life upon. I had devoted years to studying the Torah, following every commandment, teaching others to do the same. But in that moment, standing in the presence of Jesus, I realized something I had never allowed myself to consider. What if I had only been holding on to part of the truth? What if everything I had known was leading to this very moment? I wanted to speak, to argue, to tell him that I had always sought God with all my heart. But as I opened my mouth, no words came. It wasn't because I was silenced. It was because I had nothing to say. Deep down, I knew that everything Jesus was telling me was true. I had studied the Torah my whole life, yet standing before him, I realized I had missed something. There was a depth, a connection, a fulfillment that I had never seen before. Then, the world around us shifted, and suddenly, I wasn't just standing in the light anymore. I was seeing visions. Vivid, undeniable images unfolded before me, like pieces of a puzzle coming together for the first time. I saw Abraham on Mount Moriah, his hand trembling as he prepared to sacrifice his son Isaac. But then the scene changed, and I saw another man, carrying a cross, walking up a hill. I gasped as I recognized what I was looking at. Jesus. He was the sacrifice, the fulfillment of what Abraham's moment had foreshadowed. The weight of that realization hit me like a wave. The visions kept coming. I saw Moses in the desert, raising the bronze serpent so that the people of Israel could be healed. But intertwined with that image was Jesus on the cross, his arms stretched out, offering healing not just for a moment, but for eternity. I saw Isaiah's words come to life. The suffering servant, despised and rejected, pierced for our transgressions. It was all connected, all leading to this truth. The Torah, the prophets, the scriptures I had dedicated my life to, they weren't separate from Jesus. They were pointing to him all along. Tears streamed down my face as the weight of what I was seeing crushed me. How had I been blind to this for so long? How had I spent my entire life reading these scriptures, teaching them, memorizing them, and yet never truly understanding what they were pointing to? I had always believed that the Messiah was still to come, that he would establish a kingdom on earth in a way we could see and touch. But now, standing here in the presence of Jesus, I realized the truth. His kingdom had already come, but it was not of this world. I turned to Jesus, my voice shaking. How did we miss it? The sorrow in his eyes was unmistakable, but there was no anger, no condemnation, only love. Because you searched for a kingdom of this world, he said gently, and I came to establish a kingdom not of this world. His words cut through me, and I understood. We had expected a warrior, a ruler who would overthrow empires and establish power. But Jesus had come to conquer something far greater: sin, death, and separation from God. And I had missed it, just as so many before me had. Suddenly, the light around us shifted, and the warmth I had felt was replaced by something else. The peace disappeared, replaced by a cold emptiness that made my entire being tremble. The visions returned, but this time, they were not of prophecy or fulfillment. They were of separation. I found myself in a place unlike anything I had ever known. A darkness so heavy, so suffocating, that I could barely comprehend it. And within that darkness, I saw them. Souls, countless souls, reaching out, crying in agony. But they weren't just suffering. They were lost, consumed by regret, by the unbearable weight of realizing what they had rejected. The cries of those souls echoed through the darkness, a sound so full of sorrow and regret that it shook me to my core. They weren't being tortured, not in the way I had once imagined. Their suffering wasn't coming from fire or chains. It was coming from within. It was the pain of knowing they had been given the truth, that love and salvation had been within their grasp, and they had turned away. It was separation, complete and final, from the presence of God. And that, I realized, was the worst torment of all. I wanted to look away, to shut out the sight before me, but I couldn't. My heart ached as I saw their faces, twisted in anguish, their hands reaching for something they could no longer touch. I felt a deep sorrow settle in my chest, unlike anything I had ever experienced. These weren't just nameless souls. They had once been people, just like me. People who had lived, who had laughed, who had made choices. And now they were here, trapped in an eternity of regret. Jesus' voice broke through the silence. Separation is not imposed. It is chosen. The words hit me like a storm. For so long, I had believed that righteousness came through obedience, through strict adherence to the law. But now, I saw it clearly. It was never just about the law. It was always about relationship, a relationship with the very God I had spent my life serving, but had never truly known. Jesus turned to me, his eyes filled with both sorrow and love. "You have been shown this so that you may understand," he said. "But your journey is not over." The darkness faded, and before I could even process what had just happened, I felt myself being pulled back. The sensation was unlike anything I had ever felt, as if I were being pulled through time and space, away from the darkness, away from Jesus, back toward the life I had left behind. I wanted to stay. I wanted to ask more questions, to understand everything fully. But Jesus had made it clear. My journey wasn't over. The light around me dimmed, the warmth faded, and suddenly, I felt a crushing weight pressing down on my chest. A sharp gasp tore from my lungs as my body jolted awake. I was back. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled my nose, the beeping of monitors ringing in my ears. My vision was blurry, but I could see figures moving around me. Doctors, nurses, and then Leah. She was at my side, gripping my hand so tightly that I could feel the tremble in her fingers. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "You're alive. Thank God you're alive." I wanted to tell her everything, to explain what had happened, but my throat was dry, my voice weak, and even if I could speak, where would I even begin? For days, I lay in that hospital bed, recovering physically while my mind wrestled with everything I had seen. I knew what had happened was real. I had stood before Jesus. I had seen the truth with my own eyes. But how could I tell my family, my congregation? My entire life had been built around the Torah, around guiding others in the faith I had once believed was complete. And now, I had to face the reality that I had been missing the most important part of it all. Would they even believe me? Would they listen? Or would they see me as a traitor, a man who had lost his way? The weight of that question pressed on me, heavier than anything I had ever carried. How could I, a rabbi, stand before my family, my congregation, and tell them that everything I had once rejected was true? That Jesus, whom I had dismissed, whom I had argued against, was the Messiah we had been waiting for all along? The fear of their reactions nearly silenced me, but deep in my soul, I felt something stronger than fear. It was the same presence I had felt in the light, the same voice that had spoken to me with both love and authority. You are called. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself. The truth wasn't just for me. It was for those still searching, still waiting, still unaware of the fullness of God's plan. But telling my wife was one thing. Telling my congregation was another. One evening, after the doctors had given me permission to return home, I finally told Leah everything. Every vision, every word, every moment in the presence of Jesus. I expected disbelief, maybe even anger, but instead, she just listened, her fingers gripping the edge of the chair as silent tears fell down her face. When I finished, she didn't speak right away. Then, in a trembling voice, she whispered, "I believe you." Her words broke something inside me, the last wall of doubt, the last bit of fear. If Leah, who had known me better than anyone, could hear this and believe, then maybe others would too. And if they didn't, if they walked away, if they rejected me, then so be it. I had been given the truth, and I could no longer remain silent. So I prepared myself for the hardest conversation of my life. I was going to tell my congregation, the very people who had trusted me to lead them in faith, that the very foundation of what I had once taught them was incomplete. The day I stood before my congregation, my heart pounded harder than it ever had before. These were the people I had guided, counseled, and prayed with for years. They had trusted me to teach them the ways of God, to help them walk in His commandments. And now, I was about to tell them something that would challenge everything they thought they knew. My hands trembled as I stepped forward, scanning the familiar faces in the crowd. Some looked at me with warmth and expectation, unaware of what was coming. Others, perhaps sensing my unease, watched me with quiet concern. I took a deep breath and began. I told them about what had happened that day, about the pain, the ambulance, and how I had watched from above as my own body lay lifeless. I described the light, the presence, and the overwhelming peace I had felt. Their expressions shifted. Some leaned in, captivated, while others exchanged wary glances. But then I said His name, Jesus, and the room changed. I heard quiet gasps, saw heads shake in disbelief. Yet I pressed on, telling them about the visions, the undeniable fulfillment of Scripture, the connection between the Torah and the Messiah we had been waiting for all along. Some people stood up and walked out. That was the hardest part. Watching men and women I had known for years turn their backs on me, refusing to even hear the rest of what I had to say. I had expected it, but that didn't make it hurt any less. Still, I kept going, speaking to those who remained. Some had tears in their eyes. Some sat frozen, processing what they were hearing. A few nodded, as if something deep inside them had been stirred. When I finished, there was silence. A long, heavy silence. And then, a single voice. "Tell me more." That was all I needed. The voice came from an older man in the back of the room, someone I had known for years. His question broke the silence, and for the first time since I began speaking, I felt the weight on my chest lighten. He wanted to hear more. That meant there was hope. So I did what I had set out to do. I told them everything. I explained how the scriptures we had studied our entire lives weren't separate from Jesus, but were leading to him all along. I spoke of Abraham and Isaac, of Moses and the bronze serpent, of Isaiah's suffering servant. I showed them how the pieces fit together, how the prophecies were fulfilled in Jesus in a way that couldn't be ignored. Some listened intently, their eyes filled with uncertainty but also curiosity. Others sat with their arms crossed, rigid and unmoving. I could tell that for many of them, what I was saying was too much to accept. It wasn't just about theology. It was about identity, tradition, everything we had ever known. I understood because I had been there, too. The thought of letting go of what I had believed for so long had been terrifying. But the truth wasn't something I could run from anymore. The truth had found me, and I knew it was my responsibility to share it. By the time I finished speaking, the congregation was no longer the same. Some still rejected what I had said, unable or unwilling to accept it. But others, maybe only a few, but still more than I expected, stayed behind. They wanted to talk. They wanted to understand. And in that moment, I realized that this was only the beginning. My journey with Jesus wasn't just about what had happened in the light. It was about what I would do with the truth now that I had returned. It was about helping others see what I had seen, even if it meant losing everything I had once held on to. In the days that followed, the reactions to my experience spread beyond the synagogue. Some members of my congregation distanced themselves completely, whispering that I had been deceived, that I had lost my way. Friends I had known for years stopped returning my calls. Others, including some of my closest colleagues, confronted me directly, telling me I was confused, that my near-death experience was nothing more than a dream, a trick of the mind. But I knew better. What I had seen, what I had felt, it was more real than anything I had ever known in my physical life. Despite the rejection, there were those who stayed. Some met with me privately, asking me to explain more, to show them in Scripture what I had seen in my visions. I watched as the same realization that had shaken me to my core began to settle in their hearts as well. They weren't just listening out of curiosity. They were searching, just as I had been. They wanted to know if what I was saying could truly be the fulfillment of everything we had been waiting for. And for the first time, I understood why Jesus had sent me back. It wasn't just for my own salvation. It was for theirs, too. My wife, Leah, became my greatest source of strength. She stood by me through every challenge, every moment of doubt and fear. We studied together, prayed together, and slowly, her own faith in Jesus as the Messiah began to grow. It wasn't just me on this journey anymore. God was working through my testimony in ways I had never imagined. And so, I made a choice. I would not stay silent. I would not let fear stop me from sharing the truth that had been revealed to me, even if it cost me my reputation, my friendships, or everything I had built my life upon. What mattered now was following Jesus, no matter where that road led. As more time passed, the weight of my decision became clearer. My role as a rabbi, as a teacher of the Torah, had once given me a place of honor in my community. But now, I was seen as an outsider, a man who had strayed too far from tradition. Invitations to speak at gatherings stopped coming. The respect I had spent years earning vanished almost overnight. And yet, through all of it, I felt a peace I had never known before. It was the same peace I had felt in the light, the same presence that had surrounded me when I stood before Jesus. I wasn't alone, and I never would be again. With Leah's support, I continued studying both the Torah and the New Testament, finding connections I had never seen before. I started writing down my experience, sharing my testimony with anyone who would listen. Some people came out of curiosity, some to argue, but others came because something deep inside them was stirring, the same way it had for me. I met people who had secretly questioned the things they had been taught, but were too afraid to voice their doubts. And through those conversations, I realized something incredible. God was already working in their hearts, just as He had in mine. One day, I received a message from a man who had been in my congregation for years. He had been one of the ones who stayed behind after my first sermon about my experience. In his message, he told me that he had started reading the New Testament in secret, comparing it to the scriptures we had studied together for so long. And then he wrote something that brought tears to my eyes. I see it now. I finally see it. That moment changed everything for me. I knew then that no rejection, no loss, no amount of suffering could ever compare to the joy of even one person finding the truth. From that moment on, my mission became clear. I wasn't just meant to tell my story. I was meant to help others see the truth that had been hidden from them for so long. I started meeting with those who had questions, those who, like me, had spent their whole lives devoted to the Torah but were beginning to wonder if they had missed something greater. I spoke with them not as a preacher, not as someone trying to convert them, but as a man who had seen the truth with his own eyes and could no longer turn away from it. Not everyone was open to hearing it. Some meetings ended with anger, with men I had once called brothers telling me I was lost, that I had betrayed our faith. I understood their frustration. I had been in their place once, too, certain of what I knew, unwilling to listen to anything that challenged it. But then there were those moments, those conversations where I saw the same realization dawn in their eyes that had shaken me to my core. They weren't just hearing my words. They were feeling the same call, the same invitation that Jesus had extended to me in the light. The more I shared my story, the more I saw the hand of God moving, not just in my life, but in the lives of those around me. It was no longer just about my near-death experience. It was about what came after. It was about the lives being changed, the hearts being opened, the veil being lifted from those who had been searching but never knew what they were looking for. And in those moments, I understood something else. My near-death experience wasn't an ending. It was just the beginning. As the months passed, my life took a completely different path than I had ever expected. The man I had been before, Rabbi Daniel Cohen, the teacher, the scholar, the man who once dismissed Jesus as nothing more than a misinterpretation, was gone. In his place was someone who had been broken, humbled, and rebuilt by the truth. And though I had lost so much, friends, reputation, the life I had once known, I had gained something far greater. I had found the Messiah. My relationship with Leah deepened in ways I never thought possible. We prayed together, studied together, and for the first time in my life, I felt a connection to God that wasn't based on duty, but on love. The weight of trying to earn righteousness through laws and traditions was gone. Jesus had fulfilled what I had spent my entire life striving toward, and now, all I had to do was follow him. It was no longer about proving myself worthy. It was about accepting the grace that had been offered to me all along. I don't know where this journey will take me next. I don't know how many more people will walk away when they hear my story, or how many will stay and listen. But what I do know is this: Jesus is real. He is the fulfillment of every promise, every prophecy, every longing of the human heart. And if my story has reached you today, if something inside you is stirring, don't ignore it. Seek the truth. Open your heart. And when you do, I promise, Jesus will be waiting for you, just as he was waiting for me. If this testimony has touched you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. If you have questions, if you're searching, if you need prayer, leave your name. I want to pray for you. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories of transformation, faith, and truth, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. You never know whose life might be changed by a single story. Thank you for listening. And remember, the truth is worth seeking, no matter where it leads.